told it today, we knew that we were in the midst of a disaster. And it's a disaster that was imminently preventable. We, in 2018, confronted many of these challenges, and we laid out the concerns in the lawsuit that Fair Fight Action filed in 2019. But we have also been working closely with state and local leaders trying to prepare for what we knew would be disastrous if not done properly. The Secretary of State and this administration decided to purchase new machines over the objections of many, intended to roll them out, and to do so without the adequate preparation. We know that in 2002, when Kathy Cox served as Secretary of State, and there was also a purchase of new machines, there were exhaustive steps taken to ensure that every person, every staff person was trained, that there were extra Secretary of State officials on hand across the state of Georgia, that each voter had mailed instructions to help them understand the process. And that was done without the threat of COVID-19. What we know happened this week, this month, in this process is that the best intentions met the worst preparation. And we found ourselves in the midst of both incompetence and malfeasance. And unfortunately, the Secretary of State is now trying to shift the blame, and he's trying to create a pretext that only a few counties are being impacted and that this is a localized problem. But that is untrue. Across the state of Georgia, from Morgan County to Jasper County, from Fulton to DeKalb, but Clayton to Muskogee to Chatham, in every area of our state, we are seeing folks who are being denied the right to vote or being forced to wait in hours-long lines. And the problem is when people are forced to wait in lines that can stretch as long as 5, 6, 7 hours, we don't know who leaves. We don't know who gives up because they cannot afford to stay. We know that the absentee ballot initiative, which was the right thing to do, immediately ran into problems when the out-of-state vendor was selected who could not meet the challenge of the moment. For example, my absentee ballot, when it finally arrived, had an unusable return envelope. And so I had to vote in person today because I could not replace that envelope. We know across the state, thousands of requests for absentee ballots were not returned. And we know that this was a preventable problem if we had done the work, if the Secretary of State and his office had held to their responsibility. Now, you're going to hear the Secretary of State say that under his leadership, turnout increased, but any problems belong to the counties. That is a passing of the buck, and it is a false reading of the Constitution of Georgia. Georgia places the Secretary of State in charge of elections. That means training, that means giving direction, and that means investment. And every time there was a flare sent up that there was a problem facing us in this election, it was the Secretary of State's responsibility to work with the counties to solve those problems, especially when it is the most populous counties in the state. It is not sufficient to say that the county you live in determines the quality of your democracy. That's why we have a secretary of the entire state, not just the counties that do it right, not just the counties that have the resources, not just the counties that he likes, but he's the secretary of the entire state of Georgia's elections process. And so we will continue through Fair Fight Action in cooperation with the Democratic Party of Georgia and other organizations to fight to fix our elections. Because what happened today, what happened last week, what has happened over the last few months cannot be repeated in November. Democracy is too important. And we cannot divorce today's bad behavior and terrible, terrible execution. We cannot divorce it from the protests and the demonstrations that are happening around the country, including here in Georgia. Because voting is not simply about pulling a lever, pushing a button, making a selection. It's about setting the direction of our communities. It's about determining how we are going to respond to the catastrophe of COVID-19, to not only the public health crisis, but the economic crisis that will continue to assail us. It's about paying attention to the issues of police brutality, paying attention to the necessity of fixing the systemic inequities that have given Georgia among the highest rates of COVID-19, particularly for African Americans. It's about how we prepare for the next decade. And those choices can only be made when voters have the right and the ability to vote in the state of Georgia. We are going to watch slow returns come in tonight, and we need to prepare for this on a national level, because what's happening in Georgia, while it once again is a singular example of the failed leadership of the Republican Party, it is also emblematic of what's going to happen around this country as voter suppression becomes an all-out war. As they watch the returns, as they watch the numbers of people who show up, the multi-ethnic, multi-generational turnout that we've seen here in Georgia, we know that Republican voter suppression is only going to amp up. And we have to be prepared to fight back. Fair Fight is doing that work, as are a number of organizations, but it's going to be incumbent upon every American to demand that no matter which state we're in, that no state should look like Georgia did today. That's what we're calling for, and we hope that we can work with the Secretary of State to correct the errors, to fully and properly resource our counties, and to ensure that every vote can be cast and every vote can be counted in November of 2020.